Preparing for a fianchetto, white aims to control the long diagonal and potentially develop a powerful bishop. Asserting central influence, this thrust immediately contests the d4 square and prepares development for the queenside. Awaiting a suitable pawn advance to break open the center, preparing for pawn levering. Developing the knight to c6 immediately contests central space and prepares for further piece activity. Asserting central space with that pawn push sets up a potential Sicilian defense structure, but it also creates an isolated pawn on c4. Black prepares to fianchetto the bishop, mirroring white's setup and creating solid diagonal pressure. Developing the knight here immediately contests central squares and prepares for pawn advances, hinting at aggressive intentions. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal solidifies black's kingside fianchetto and prepares for central action. Developing the knight to f3 efficiently shores up the central tension and prepares castling, offering robust king safety. Anchoring the center and preparing for a queenside expansion, this solidifies black's pawn structure. Securing the monarch in the corner opens up the rook for potential central influence and prepares for future queenside operations, a sensible defensive maneuver given black's central pawn presence and the nascent tension developing. Opening lines for tactical skirmishes, the bishop ventures forth, immediately challenging white's central grip and eyeing the queenside. 7b3 carefully avoids immediate pawn tension, opting for a flexible setup that prepares for kingside expansion while reinforcing the queenside pawn structure and discouraging black's bishop from easily targeting c2. Unleashing the queen to d7 aims to challenge white's central pawn structure, potentially eyeing the e3 square and preparing for a queenside expansion, while also providing a safe haven for the queen should complications arise on the kingside. Developing the bishop to a more active square, this maneuver aims to control the long diagonal and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queenside, while keeping an eye on black's central influence. Challenging white's central dominance, this pawn thrust immediately injects tension and demands a response, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Anchoring the center and preparing to develop the queen's bishop feels solid, but it does concede a touch of central influence. Be mindful of potential pawn breaks from black on e4 or c4. It might be wise to solidify your king's safety with h3 later, preventing any backward pawn advances. Developing the knight to e7 prepares to challenge the center more directly, potentially supporting e4 push or repositioning for a queenside attack, while also freeing the f8 square for the bishop. This is a measured approach, solidifying the pawn center and opening a path for the queen's rook, though it somewhat restricts the bishop on g2's diagonal for the moment. White prioritizes structural integrity over immediate piece activity, anticipating black's potential pawn breaks. Preventing a kingside pawn storm by nudging the h-pawn forward creates a valuable escape square for the king, while simultaneously preparing to challenge the center with a timely f5 push, reinforcing the pawn chain and potentially opening lines against white's castled position. Developing the queen to e2 aims to connect the rooks and potentially support a kingside pawn storm later, while keeping an eye on the d6 pawn and the central dark squares. Returning the king to safety is a sensible reaction, solidifying the monarch's position after an earlier foray into the wing. This establishes a crucial defensive cornerstone, allowing for further piece development and potentially preparing for a central pawn thrust or a gradual buildup on the queenside. The immediate danger of a potential queenside pawn push or piece infiltration is now significantly diminished, granting black more freedom to maneuver its remaining forces. Preparing to expand on the queenside, white establishes a more solid structure, intending to potentially push the b-pawn and create further space. Developing the bishop to e6 completes black's kingside castling protection and activates the piece, eyeing potential advances on the kingside and reinforcing the central pawn structure. Establishing control of the semi-open c-file is the primary objective here, potentially creating a future outpost for the knight or supporting a queenside pawn advance. Unleashing the kingside pawn wedge dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating immediate tension and potentially opening lines towards the white king, while also preparing to contest central squares more aggressively. Shifting the knight to d2 aims to reinforce the central tension and potentially reroute the piece to a more active square, perhaps f3 or even e4 if the opportunity arises, while also preparing to support a future pawn push on the queen side. Embracing the open flank, this rook now aims to dominate the queen side, its presence potentially unbalancing the queenside structure and creating future pawn storms or targeted attacks. Initiating an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, white boldly challenges black's central foothold and seeks to pry open lines towards the castled monarch. Seeking a safer haven, your king retreats from the center, anticipating a potential pawn storm on the kingside initiated by white's f4 advance. This move activates the bishop on a normally passive diagonal, eyeing black's kingside where the pawn chain is looking a little vulnerable due to the f5 push. White is subtly aiming to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from black's ambitious central pawn play, perhaps preparing a future e4 push or simply putting more pressure on the f6 square. Seeking to solidify queenside space and prepare for potential pawn advances like b5, this maneuver shores up the pawn chain and offers an escape square on a7 for the rook should the c-file become contested, all while keeping the bishop on g7 well supported. Focusing the queen on the kingside, aiming to support a potential pawn storm or create pressure along the g-file, while also keeping an eye on the central squares. Embracing the flank, this pawn thrust aims to pry open the queenside, creating immediate counterplay against white's seemingly solid setup. It injects dynamism into a rather positional struggle, seeking to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially gain control of the open b-file. The intention is clear: to challenge white's space advantage and force a reaction, perhaps by creating weaknesses in white's central structure as a consequence of defending the queenside. White is desperately trying to unlock the queenside, hoping the bishop on a1 can influence the b-file or perhaps pivot to the kingside. But this maneuver leaves the king's flank somewhat exposed and invites further pressure from black's active pieces. Black aggressively challenges white's queenside space with this pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt the control white has established with the bishop and rook battery. It's a bold decision to advance the b-pawn so early, potentially creating weaknesses, but also opening avenues for counterplay and creating dynamic imbalances on the board. The tension on the queenside is now palpable, forcing white to decide whether to capture, push further, or retreat. The knight now claims a commanding central outpost, disrupting black's pawn chain and creating immediate pressure on the d6 square. This aggressive repositioning aims to exploit the slightly exposed nature of black's king after the pawn advances on the kingside, while simultaneously opening up lines for white's pieces to penetrate. The knight's presence here forces black to consider defensive maneuvers carefully, potentially leading to passive play or tactical concessions. Exposing your kingside pawn structure, this capture sacrifices material for a fleeting queenside initiative, potentially leaving your king bereft of its usual shield and inviting a dangerous pawn storm. The knight's sacrifice ignites a tactical storm, aiming to dismantle black's pawn shield and expose the king. This exchange disrupts black's pawn structure on the queenside, creating potential weaknesses. Reclaiming the knight to its natural outpost on e7 not only fortifies the central pawn structure, but also prepares for a potential counterthrust along the e-file, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly solid setup. Shifting the bishop to the c3 square fundamentally alters the pawn chain's dynamics, creating a potential outpost for white's knight on d5 and a clearer diagonal for the light-squared bishop. Suddenly, the pressure on the c-file intensifies as black reinforces their presence, preparing to contest this crucial open corridor. White is consolidating their pieces, aiming to create a more cohesive defense and potentially launch a counteroffensive on the queenside. With the rook now protected by the queen and bishop, white intends to challenge black's control over the c-file and potentially liberate the d3 pawn for future pawn advances. Shifting the queen from its attacking post, white prioritizes developing a solid defensive structure, preparing to support potential pawn pushes or meet black's aggressive pawn advances. The queen's redeployment addresses the slight overextension on the queen side and allows for better coordination with the remaining pieces, anticipating future skirmishes. By repositioning the queen, white is looking to re-establish equilibrium on the board, preparing for a more strategic maneuvering phase rather than immediate tactical fireworks. Challenging the central pawn structure, the queen repositions itself to eye the king side and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. A strategic redeployment, the bishop journeys back to its starting square, aiming to reinforce the kingside defenses and prepare for a potential kingside attack or simply to escape the immediate pressure on the c-file, simultaneously preparing to exert influence on the long diagonal should the center open. Black boldly injects central activity, seeking to shatter white's pawn structure and liberate their pieces from their current cramped positions. White now aims to redeploy the knight, preparing to contest the crucial e-file and potentially initiate a queenside expansion with the pawn majority. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside often comes with a positional cost, and black's recent advance of the e-pawn seeks to exploit the overextended nature of white's pieces, particularly the knight on f3, creating a wedge that will complicate white's defensive structure. Breaching the pawn chain with the knight opens up new avenues of attack, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create mating threats. The pawn sacrifice on b3 immediately throws open a critical diagonal for black's queen and threatens to disrupt white's pawn structure. This audacious pawn push seizes initiative by creating a direct threat, forcing white to consider immediate defensive measures rather than continuing their positional buildup. Black's aggressive advance on b3 dramatically alters the tactical landscape, introducing sharp lines and potential for immediate material gain if white miscalculates. By relinquishing a pawn, black gambles on rapid development and a cascade of subsequent threats, aiming to overwhelm white's now somewhat awkward piece placement. This pawn sacrifice fundamentally shifts the game's dynamic, aiming to pry open lines and exploit any potential disarray in white's central control. Reclaiming the open d-file is a crucial step, aiming to disrupt black's aggressive pawn structure and potentially create counterplay through the center. Black surrenders central control, hoping to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines. This daring pawn sacrifice aims to exploit the now exposed white king and activate black's rook on the open d-file. The consequence of this immediate pawn grab is a significant commitment of black's pieces to the queen side, potentially leaving the king vulnerable if white can organize a swift central counterattack or exploit the newly created weaknesses. Unleashing the rook onto the open d-file immediately leverages the pawn structure's disruption, aiming to exploit the newly exposed weaknesses around black's monarch and potentially seize control of the central diagonals with the bishop pair. Sacrificing the pawn opens a critical diagonal for the queen and aims to disrupt white's central control by forcing exchanges, potentially leading to a more dynamic position for black despite the material imbalance. Reclaiming the open d-file for central pressure, white repositions the rook to contest black's rapidly advancing pawn storm. Securing the newly opened d-file becomes paramount, a strategic decision to challenge white's central control and potentially activate the rook for future operations down the open corridor. Unleashing a pawn storm, this advance on the kingside aims to disrupt black's solidified pawn structure and create attacking chances. Baffling, instead of reinforcing the newly opened h-file or developing a piece with purpose, black chooses to petrify a pawn on the flank, potentially hindering any future counterplay from that side while offering nothing in return. Shifting the king to the h-file provides a vital escape route, untangling the monarch from the potential skirmishes brewing on the center and queenside files, while simultaneously offering a clear path for potential king-side defense or even a surprising counterattack should circumstances allow. Activating the knight to a central outpost injects immediate dynamism into black's position, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses created by white's pawn structure and knight placement. Initiating a decisive exchange, this recapture aims to simplify the position while drawing black's queen into a more exposed central location, potentially setting up future pressure on the d-file. Unleashing a daring sacrifice. By offering the rook, Black ignites a wild tactical sequence, aiming to shatter White's central control and open lines towards the king. This gambit, though appearing desperate, potentially traps White's queen and disrupts any semblance of harmonious development, throwing the game into a chaotic, unpredictable state where initiative becomes paramount. Sacrificing the rook to initiate a decisive queenside onslaught aims to disrupt Black's already precarious pawn structure and potentially isolate the Black queen. A desperate gambit, sacrificing material to disrupt White's pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay, hoping to exploit the exposed king. Initiating a dynamic counterattack, this capture opens up the central files, aiming to exploit Black's potentially exposed king and create immediate threats while forcing a reassessment of the board's balance. A bold attempt to seize the initiative in a collapsing position, sacrificing material for a desperate counterattack. The rook now claims an open file, immediately pressuring the pinned knight and aiming to exploit the exposed pawn structure on the king side. Abandoning the contested central files, Black seeks simplification in a materially balanced, yet positionally complex endgame. Opening up the king's diagonal now, after a series of exchanges, creates immediate threats along the newly cleared g-file, potentially targeting underdeveloped pieces or weak squares near Black's monarch, forcing a defensive posture. Pushing that passed pawn is a desperate but perhaps necessary gamble, forcing White to either defend meticulously or lose material in a way that might open dangerous avenues for the Black king, even with the material deficit. The rook's relocation to the active 7th rank now aims to exploit the potential weakness created by Black's pawn pushing on the queen side, seeking to disrupt the pawn chain and perhaps even penetrate into Black's territory. This final pawn push offers a tantalizing prospect of disrupting White's pawn chain, a subtle attempt to inject some life into a position that has become somewhat static after the flurry of exchanges.